We will have first a presentation by Abby Santo of Communication and Theater Arts, who is also the co-founder of something called Media Commons, which he will tell you more about. And his presentation is called When New Modes of Publishing Meet Old Modes of Evaluation, Rethinking Our Credentials. And again, an important topic. We will then have a panel of individuals, along with, I hope, Abby joining the panel, will be Michelle Kelly from Psychology, and also Bob Lucking from Department of Teaching and Learning, and Lucas Flatt, who is a graduate student and director or general managing editor, sorry, of BarelySouth.com, which is again an online initiative run by graduate students at ODU. So those will be individuals who will be able to give us a perspective from someone who's on the cutting edge and doing this at the beginning, and then senior faculty who have to try to figure out how it impacts them and their careers. So I'm looking forward to it, and with that I will turn the podium over to Abby Santo. Thank you.
Hi everybody. First of all, thank you to Elaine for inviting me to this, and thank you all for turning out to this. It's nice to turn out. I'm going to do essentially two things here in this presentation. I'm going to spend the first 6 or 7 minutes telling you about Media Commons, which is the project that I'm the co-founder of, just to give you a sense of what we do and what it's about, and kind of introduce you to some of the issues that we grapple with. And then the second part is a much more traditional presentation where I talk a little bit about essentially sort of where I see some of the kind of challenges for online publishing and some of the ways we might want to rethink sort of what we do as academics in those environments. So, this is Media Commons. It was founded in 2006 by myself and Dr. Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who is currently the head of the MLA, the Modern Language Association's Digital Services Division. And it was envisioned at the start as essentially an experiment in born digital publishing, particularly with an interest in sort of trying to imagine what a born digital press would look like and how it would function. Right? So we envisioned it from the beginning as sort of operating similar to a university press that publishes traditional books and journals, and wanted to sort of conceptualize how an online, a born digital variation of a scholarly press would essentially function. This was created initially with support from the MacArthur Foundation through the Institute for the Future of the Book, which is a really innovative operation out of New York City that is really invested in rethinking sort of future forms of publishing and writing. Very quickly, we sort of changed our understanding when we started trying to envision what we would do, and we started moving away from thinking of ourselves as a born digital press and really as a scholarly network. Although, as you'll see, the kind of lines between a press and a network are fuzzy, and I think this partly speaks to the kind of ways in which it's difficult to map traditional sort of roles and titles onto online publications. I think it's one of the actual problems that we encounter in academia is our desire to somehow take the models that we are comfortable and familiar with in terms of traditional presses, traditional journals, traditional book publishing, and simply say, let's move all that into an online environment and have it work the same way, when it does not. So, the Media Commons launched in 2006, which was also the first year that I arrived here at ODU, and its first major project that was up and running is in Media Res. We started based, so the idea was Media Commons would be the kind of framework, and within it we would have several different projects that we ran. Media Res is essentially an experiment in short form publication and an attempt to create what we think of as sort of network conversations. So it's organized around theme weeks. Monday through Friday, a different scholar curates a short video clip. It's, I should also say, largely influenced coming out of media studies and the humanities and art, and that area. So a lot of the content on it is typically focused on new media, media studies, and the humanities. So in Media Res, Monday through Friday, a different scholar curates a short clip. They compose a 400-word response. They're restricted to 400 words, which is actually quite challenging for most academics who are used to basically writing in much longer form. And the idea here is that not only are they basically asked to sort of provocatively reposition this particular clip that they're working on, but also engage with one another across the week in a kind of network conversation through the comment fields. Our goal is to sort of generate what we might think of as sort of a kind of synergistic conversation where at the end of the week, the kind of commentary is much richer than any of the individual posts spanning the month. This has been around since 2006. It's actually incredibly successful. Not write down statistics, but it gets, of the various projects we have, it gets the most hits on a regular basis. And I'll tell you overall what we do in a second. I just want to call you to actually, let me one other project as well before I sort of give you some information there. Probably the project that most resembles a traditional press, although only in name only, is the Media Commons Press project. This is a project that works off of WordPress, but what it does is it basically is an experimental site in open peer review, and it utilizes a tool called Comment Press, which allows for horizontal commenting right now at the paragraph level, but we're working towards getting it down to the sort of sentence and word level, so that ultimately what you can have is essentially sort of horizontal commenting and conversations happening live online. So if you want to think about sort of how the comment functions in a Word document work when you're responding, when you're replying there, but in a sort of live forum, it allows for that kind of level of engagement. And we have several projects that are published through this. I just want to show you one that's been, one of our most recent ones that's been fairly successful. Complex TV is a book by Dr. Jason Mattel. It's under contract at NYU Press, and NYU Press agreed to basically pre-publish the book in serialized form, the kind of early version of the book in serialized form. Every month they publish a new chapter, and it's open for review. And and Dr. Mattel has basically agreed to incorporate any revision suggestions made by the community into the sort of next draft that will be coming out in print, I believe, this summer. As a side announcement, Jason Mattel will actually be coming to ODU to talk about this book project on April 18th. I'm happy to give people more information about that if they're curious. And just to give you a sense of sort of how this operates, we can see here that you can basically sort of, you can read, if you go to any individual chapter, you can read them on a chapter by chapter basis. And what you would do is you would basically go through the chapter, and if you wanted to add a comment or simply read the comments, click on the little comment bar, and it would basically call up the comment here. This wants me to leave a comment, but if you calls up the comments that's been left, and just to give you a sense of it. This gives you a breakdown of sort of all the comments by section. You can also sort of filter it by commenter. So what it does is it provides a couple of different sort of possibilities for the author, right? On one hand, he can basically filter comments, right? So that although it's open to the public and anyone can comment, if he's only interested in sort of seeing comments by particular scholars in his field, he can filter those comments out and only see the ones that he thinks are more valuable. On the other hand, as readers, you can also choose to simply read the comments and not the book itself if you're particularly interested in, in a particular sort of person's assessment of it. And you can basically sort of filter that material in that way. It's been an interesting experiment. It's been really successful on a number of levels. We have a good partnership with NYU Press, New York University Press, with this. This is the third book that we've done in this way with them. We're inching towards a process where, right now, the way it works is that the book is already accepted for publication before it goes through this open review, so it's already gone through a blind peer review process initially, and then it's open to review upon revision. We're moving towards trying to negotiate with them so that the next one would be ultimately just simply an open review from the beginning, before the contract is in place. So to give you a sense of the kind of traffic we get, numbers are often misleading, and I'll address this in a minute as well. In December of 2012, the site had 392,009 unique page views. So that's a lot of traffic for the site. There's across a number of different projects. Some projects get a lot more attention than others do. But that's a lot of traffic, and if any of you have been, if any of you work for academic journals or other sorts of projects, those are big numbers. Those are not the types of numbers that most journals get. Numbers are misleading. They don't tell us very much about what people do with the content of the site or how they use it, but it's an indication at the very least that we're getting quite a lot of attention from that. One last thing, and then I will actually turn to the real presentation here. I'm also very happy to talk about I'll have to talk about this project later on in the Q&A. Lastly, very recently, in this past September, we launched a new project on the site, which was our front page project. We actually just redesigned the front page for the website. It's not what it looked like even less than a year ago. And with that, we introduced a new project, which is our survey project. You're seeing it right there. This is a project that's run by ODU grad students, primarily right now out of English Communications and the Institute for Humanities, though it's open to any student who's interested in these types of things. And what this project does is it really sort of is trying to take the front page and transform it into a kind of centralized hub for thinking about broader questions about ePublishing. So what it does is basically how each month we post a different survey question. This month's survey question is about the digital divide in the humanities and in digital publishing, right? So where do we see the gaps and the absences in terms of this types of work? And we invite a different scholar from a range of fields to basically provide daily a blog post on the site that they basically get to sort of respond to the question. And this is basically a way to kind of try and generate a broader conversation about sort of the state of e-publishing, and particularly for our interest in digital humanities, which is where we're coming out of. So, anyways, that gives you a kind of brief introduction to what we're doing on this particular site. I want to sort of spend the rest of my time really talking more broadly about e-publishing. Some of this applies to Media Commons, some of this does not, and I think hopefully we'll dovetail nicely with the other presenters' work. So, e-publishing typically is either embraced, sometimes a little bit too naively, or looked upon with suspicion by many academics. But what's clear is that as traditional print publications begin to fold, as academic publishers become more selective in terms of their catalogs, and simply, as more of us enter into the academy, there are more people graduating with PhDs than ever before in some ways, there are fewer venues to publish in. And so to some extent, whether we view it positively or negatively, e-publishing is often viewed as a necessary alternative for people looking to get their work out there in front of an audience. Sometimes it's viewed as a sort of necessary evil, sometimes it's looked upon as something that's very exciting. The concerns about e-publishing in some ways really kind of revolve around three broad areas as I see them. There's a supposedly diminished, if not entirely absent, gatekeeping mechanism, i.e. sort of questions about how peer review works in these environments and what happens when we basically don't have or have a sort of either don't have a peer review process or an open review process. How does that affect the rigor of the work? How does that basically how does that help us assess its quality? For those of you who are grad students thinking about publishing, one of the things that happens in a traditional print journal mechanism is that for most part they operate on a double-blind peer review process, which means that the reviewer does not know you and you do not know them, at least in theory, although as these fields are often quite small, that's not always the case. And the idea is that by having a double-blind peer review process, you maintain a kind of a certain kind of rigor, right, where the reviewer has the ability to be critical of the work because they are shielded from through anonymity, and the reviewer is assured that basically the work will not be that the work will not be judged based on their personal reputation, but based on its actual merits. Again, in theory, that's how that operates. So when you move to an online version, sometimes a lot of concern that usually arises is that peer review either doesn't exist or exists in an alternate form, and as a result, that gatekeeping mechanism that peer review is supposed to serve is greatly diminished. There's also a perceived status downgrade, that comes with e-publishing, in the sense that traditional print journals are much more prestigious, and that somehow this, when you choose to publish your work in these environments, you are essentially sort of admitting to some sort of lesser status as a result. And I think also a legitimate, though maybe overstated, careerist concern, right? That these types of works simply don't count either when you're on the job market or if you're going up for tenure or promotion. And I think that, those are, if we think about the kind of broadly, those tend to be the three major areas that I encounter when people sort of object or raise their eyebrows about these types of projects. And as I said, specifically, critics of e-publishing focus on a supposed lack of peer review that contributes to diminished rigor. They also focus on things like improper indexing, which makes these works hard to cite in some ways. And really, at their most derogative, opponents will point to the fact that, basically e-publishing has removed all the filters, so that basically anything from that, 30-page paper you wrote in your first grad seminar that your instructor told you had potential to, your review of the toaster you bought on Amazon.com could be suddenly considered a publication. Grossly overstated, but nonetheless, I think that those types of that type of derisiveness actually does inform the kind of conservative response that the Academy often has to these types of venues, right? This sense that because once you hit, submit, for the most part, it's quote-unquote published, we need to basically sort of be very careful of what we consider a publication in this environment. These types of concerns, to be quite honest, are boring, they're unproductive, they're fear-driven, and they're also mostly unfounded. The reality is that many e-publications actually employ very traditional double-blind peer review processes. I don't actually advocate for that. In fact, later on in this talk, I'll suggest we need to rethink that. But a lot of e-journals basically operate much like their print versions do. You submit an article, you submit an essay, it's sent out to an anonymous reviewer, it's reviewed, and if it's accepted or not, you will get those feedback. Many other e-journals utilize kind of variations of open review processes. Those certainly have their downsides to them, right? The concern in an open review process is that the reviewer will not be critical because they are, because they are basically doing this in public to some extent. I'll say, those of us who've gone through both sides of the fence will tell you that the double-blind traditional peer review process also has its problems, right? Often reviewers will hide behind anonymity to do a poor job. Many of us, I'm sure I have, and I'm going to say for certain that many of you in this room have at some point in time gotten feedback from a traditional journal on a piece you've written that was unconstructive. So in other words, though I don't want to diminish the potential downsides of open review, we shouldn't necessarily hold up the traditional double-blind review process as somehow perfect and sort of and not deserving of criticism. Many e-journals have worked with their libraries to properly index and cite their sources, right? So in other words, many of the problems that are raised to some extent are greatly overstated and are in fact things that are actively worked on. But really, the reason I find this boring and unproductive is that in some ways, the most infuriating aspect of the kind of critiques that tend to emerge around online or e-publishing essentially sort of make the concerns much more central than the possibilities, right? So that every conversation that happens around e-publishing, including this one, as I started it, really focus on, the problems, the things we need to overcome, the things we need to worry about, and to the point where, where I think people, those of us involved in this type of work, spend most of our time defensively trying to justify it rather than actually engaging with what we think is possible about it. And when you have to act from a defensive position, two things tend to happen, right? Either you basically become a kind of uncritical cheerleader of e-publishing, and that's not helpful, right? Where, I know a lot of people who do this type of work who basically will champion it to the hilt, but don't seem to be able to kind of step back and say, well, like anything else, there are things that we need to work on to make sure that the work that's being published here is of particular quality. Or the opposite, right? That you tend that a lot of people who are interested in e-publishing will too quickly compromise, and basically agree to sort of just simply try to replicate more traditional publishing and processes in an online form, right? So that's why you see a lot of new online journals that are essentially sort of publishing PDF documents of 30-page papers. And yes, that's a nice way to save some money on printing, but it's not particularly innovative in any way. The processes don't necessarily actively sort of engage with what the online world can do in an effective manner. So I want to basically suggest that there are many possibilities that we should be focusing on about what the value of e-publishing is. Some of them are pragmatic, some of them are potentially radical. and I'll try to walk through just a few of these. There are many others, so by no means definitive. Let me begin with, of course, the benefits for publishers in this environment, which are in some ways sort of, probably the least concerned to most of you, but need to be stated, right? E-publishing is environmentally sustainable. It, basically is quite easy. It actually makes it a lot easier to archive and to preserve the work, and it's more affordable at the end of the day, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's not free. Hiring programmers and certainly server space costs money, but it is a lot more affordable than printing on traditional paper and using traditional distribution methods. So for publishers, there's very clearly an advantage to these to these forums. For scholars, especially young scholars, and I know this is about sort of teacher preparation, faculty preparation, there is benefit to publishing online that is necessary, that you need to consider, regardless of whether the piece is going to be counted as a publication or not. Most importantly, I think e-publishing provides really valuable opportunities for networking and reputation building. And whether, for better or for worse, we live in an environment where increasingly, as scholars, as academics, we're expected to self-brand, right? We're expected to basically establish a kind of reputation for ourselves, bless you. And to some extent, e-publishing provides venues through which you can get your work out there to a broader public, be engaged in conversations with your peers, showcase the stuff you're working on, even if it's just works in progress, right? And no, it may or may not count, and most of it probably will not count as a publication. I will tell you that the majority of content on Media Commons doesn't count as a traditional publication, but it has been immensely valuable to for the contributors in terms of building a network of peers, establishing a reputation, getting the work out there, especially as grad students when they then go on the market to be able to say, look to the work I'm doing, and look to the kind of attention it's getting, and I know that I can build on this work to develop a sort of either a more traditional or a non-traditional publication record. And we want to think about the value of that. And I would say, I'll say this again later, right? If we remove the careerist objectives from publishing, right? That it's publish or perish. We need to publish to get a job. Most of us who choose this type of work for a living want to publish because we want to be in conversation with our peers, right? That what we want to be able to do is get our work out there, participate in a conversation, potentially sort of, get constructive feedback that either helps us to clarify or solidify our positions, and potentially influence the community through what we're saying. And there's very little doubt that I think e-publishing can provide many of those opportunities, and I would argue quite strongly that in some ways these types of venues are replacing the sort of the annual conference that many of us go to as the site of germination for potential collaborations and publications, right? That where it used to be that you would go to a conference to present a work in progress, and if it was well received, maybe somebody might approach you and say, have you thought about developing this? We'd love you to submit it to our journal, or I'm working on an anthology, a collection of collective essays, I'd love to see what you got there, right? I actually believe that e-publishing in some ways is replacing that, because the work can be published more regularly, it's more easily accessible to all kinds of constituencies, and ultimately sort of allows you to sort of build off that experience in meaningful ways. I think from a slightly more radical perspective, e-publishing can expand our understanding of who our peer networks are, right? We're very invested in this notion of wanting to be in dialogue with our peers, and much of the notion of peer review assumes that we have a clear understanding of who our peers are. But for many of us, our work is increasingly interdisciplinary. We want feedback from constituencies that aren't necessarily only our peers, right? That when you publish something in I'm going to guess here, the Journal of Psychology, right? Though it might be about, sort of the effects of media on children, I, as a media scholar, am not going to read it, right? Because many traditional academic journals cater specifically to their silos, right? And in some ways, we can see that e-publishing, because it has a much wider access, can potentially promote interdisciplinarity. It can also promote, I think, greater outreach to non-academic communities and engage them in conversations in meaningful ways. I think many of us are interested in seeing our work not just be talked about amongst a sort of very small group of 10 or 15 people, but a much broader constituency. And it allows us, I think, to rethink what we're talking about, who we think our peers are in that environment. Even more radically, I think that basically ePublishing offers scholars important opportunities to rethink the very functions of scholarly output. ePublishing allows scholars to foreground the processes of intellectual work and knowledge creation over its finished product. And I think this is in some ways the most important thing for me, and it's something that I really stress with Media Commons, right, is that what I see the function of a born digital press is, for instance, is its ability to foreground process over product. The end product, first of all, arguably stuff that is created online doesn't have an end product, right? It can continuously be evolved and changed and versioned. But what it can do very, very powerfully is demonstrate the processes through which we as scholars create knowledge, right? They can model how ideas and experiments are molded into arguments rooted in evidence and analysis. And I think that serves a very important pedagogical function for our future students, for society, right? To be able to demonstrate that kind of process on a more regular basis. I'm sure those of you who are faculty in this room, or those of you who are grad students who teach undergrads and have had some very, very smart undergrads, and some of you are faculty of some smart graduate students, I'm sure you've encountered, as I have at some point in time, that kind of anxiety from a student who is very bright, who simply says, oh, I could not write something like that, right? Where you're encouraging them to either go to grad school or continue on or maybe publish their work, and they say, well, I just couldn't write what that person wrote. And you have to basically take a moment and stop and say, well, this person didn't wake up this morning, brush their teeth, put their clothes on, and bang out a 30-page essay, right? That this is an extensive process that took a lot of time, that had a lot of collaboration from editors, reviewers, etc. And that in some ways foregrounding that process encourages people to, I think, potentially at least, encourages people to sort of engage with it in a more useful manner. And I'll say, specifically for those of us who do humanities-based work, it is sort of a truism, the humanities is under attack. It's always under attack. It's especially under attack today. I also think foregrounding process is important because it gives you the opportunity to actually suggest that there's a lot of hard work that goes into that type of analytical framework, right? That is, because there's often the perception, I think, especially amongst sort of the detractors of the humanities, that work is simply, interpretive and opinionated as opposed to truly engaging in theory and method in any meaningful way. I think, especially if we sort of think about this transparency and this process, transparency of process in the peer review area, it can help make visible what is basically an invisible collaborative mechanism, right? That, of course, even when you single author an article or a book, the reality is that many hands have played a part in shaping that, right? Whether it is a working committee of, a working group of friends who you basically workshop your work to, over a number of years, or it's presenting that work at conference and getting feedback from your peers, or it's going through a press and getting peer review from evaluators, getting suggestions from the publisher, the editor of the press, right? The myth of the kind of single-authored piece and this sort of individual scholar is exactly that, a myth, right? And we want to, and in some ways, opening up that process and making the process of collaboration more visible, not only, I think, sort of shines a light on it, on the value of collaboration within the academy, encourages that in some meaningful way, but I think it also does a couple of other really important things, right? First and foremost, it values the reviewer in a way that doesn't happen. Right now, and for those of you who are students thinking of becoming academic faculty, you'll find out that one of the things that's expected of you when you become a faculty member is that you'll be invited by journals and presses to review materials, articles and essays and books for publication. The review process is not particularly rewarding, right, in the sense that the press might offer you a couple $100 worth of books, the journal won't offer you anything. In a double-blind process, it's anonymous, right, which means that the only credit you'll get for that is hopefully a recognition on the part of the author if the work is eventually published, and that credit essentially says thank you to the anonymous reviewer who did this. Within departments and universities, that work is considered service work, right? It's expected and it's necessary work. I mean, ultimately, for anything to be published, it needs reviewers, it needs to go through that process, but it has very little reward and very little merit. As a result, what you have is you have essentially kind of three types of reviewers, right? You have, I'll really describe only two. You have the type who I think does a fantastic job. I had a colleague here who was a marvelous reviewer for journal article reviewer. She was asked to review probably a dozen articles a year because she was that good. She would provide 3-4 pages of feedback, constructive feedback, on every piece that she reviewed, whether she said accept or reject, right? That work was, of course, completely sort of devalued institutionally because she was told, focus on your own publications, not on this type of service work. Its value in the owners, but its value to the person looking to publish the work was immense. Open review actually allows those people who are tremendously good at reviewing to potentially get recognition for that work, right? Which is invaluable and should be seen as sort of an absolutely necessary thing. The other type of reviewer is the one who basically, and I should say, I'm probably talking about the extremes here. Most of us fall in the middle, which is we do a decent job, but probably could do better. But the other type of extreme reviewer is the one who has no incentive, right? In a double-blind process, right? Where because there's no reward, they basically sort of they hide behind anonymity to basically do a lackluster job. Sometimes that can be a very negative review, but sometimes it can simply be not putting all of their efforts into that process. An open review process can help police that community as well, right? The value, in other words, where the concern about open review is typically that it creates an environment where reviewers cannot be critical of the work because they are doing the work because that review is open. I think the opposite is actually true, right? That the open review process allows, on the one hand, for the community to police reviewers who are not doing their job, right? And on the other hand, to reward reviewers who are. And I think that can open up a tremendous amount of possibility. I think at its most radical, ePublishing requires scholars to really, in some ways, what's the word I'm looking for? To rethink their roles in society at a more broader level, right? Traditionally, our reputational capital is tied to our sort of designation as knowledge experts, right? A lot of our publications basically are designed to sort of show off our expertise, right? Whether to our peers or to a broader constituency. And certainly ePublishing can do that, right? You can reach a much larger audience much more quickly and basically show off your credentials that way. But in some ways that tends to misunderstand how the online world works, right? That of course, at least today, the online world is basically sort of driven by notions of interactivity, participation, and sociality. This notion of a kind of collective knowledge, a community-driven form of knowledge. And when the scholar basically tries to sort of go into that space and say, let me show you my expert credentials, they're often met with a kind of dismissive disinterest. I think that in some ways it behooves us as scholars to basically let go of our designation as experts and embrace a different type of designation in ePublishing. And that's the designation of steward, right? That we really need to think of ePublishing as a sort of model that basically promotes stewardship of knowledge, where the role of the author in that environment is less about proving their credentials and more about provoking conversation, about curating opportunities for others to basically sort of dive into it. This is a kind of radical move because at its most successful, the author recedes in importance, right? And the conversations generated around the author become the central part of the text. This is something that most of us are not going to do, right? Because in some ways, the academy has structured a kind of mechanism for reward that doesn't sort of value that. But at its most radical, we can perhaps see how ePublishing can allow scholars to take on new identities, to take on a new role in society, one that basically is much more invested in conversation than expertise. To get to this type of ePublishing would require a significant disinvestment in the generic and auteurist conventions that have become hegemonic in the academy, right? This notion of the single author working within a particular format or style, which is typically the 25-page essay. We need to abandon, in order for us to get to a place where we are knowledge stewards invested in basically investing in creating conversational networks, we would need to abandon all of that, right? Which many of us are not willing to do, and in reality, at this moment, the academy will not reward, right? So it is not a particularly sort of lucrative approach to take. But I'll tell you that there's value to be gained from thinking about scholars learning to write shorter, more accessible, more provocative as opposed to definitive pieces, and being willing to see the value of their work being presented sort of unfinished, if you will. I put unfinished in quotation marks because the reality is that anytime you submit an article to a journal, anytime you put that book to rest, it still feels unfinished, right? Most of us have that experience once we've published, that it still feels like it's not quite fully baked, but we've gotten to a point where we have to put it out there. And perhaps to some extent you might argue that e-publishing allows you to get around that kind of, that conundrum by recognizing that it is unfinished, right? That the process is what you're trying to foreground, not the end product. And I'll tell you that, there's often this kind of this dismissive or derisive argument that how can a 400-word blog post be considered a scholarly publication? And I won't debate whether it can or cannot be, but I will tell you that the vast majority of the contributors to the site, to Media Res, who are asked to, or to Media Commons, I should say, who are asked to write in these short 400-word bits, have tremendous difficulty doing so, right? In other words, it's a skill set that we haven't mastered, and so it's easy to be dismissive of it rather than basically asking ourselves to sort of be retrained, if you will, to write in a different format, to write in a different, to try and engage in a different manner. To some extent, though, if we want to think about how we basically get e-publishing to matter in a significant way, I have a couple of sort of propositions that I want to sort of put out there. One, new forms of writing require new modes of evaluation. I'm not a supporter of importing traditional double-blind peer review into e-publishing. I think that misses the opportunity to take advantage of the unique properties of the online world. But I do think that those of us who publish in the online world need to develop flexible yet standardized protocols for evaluating work. Right now, there simply is no set protocol for evaluating work that is born digital. Right? We either tend to sort of map the traditional evaluative structures we have onto born digital work, or we sort of or a lot of places simply operate in this kind of framework of the cool, right? And it's especially in my field where you're often talking about multimedia essays, visual essays that combine images, moving images, and text. There isn't a clear or rigorous set of criteria for how to evaluate though that work's scholarly merit, right? I have colleagues who base their careers on making mashups, right? Who basically take video clips from all kinds of things, and they are making, in their minds, a very clear argument about society, about the role of visual media in society, but we don't have any clear set standards for evaluating those types of works, and we need to create those standards in a very meaningful way. I think that we need to document the processes of evaluation better. As I said, a lot of these sites engage with a very clear review process, even if it's an open review process, but they don't do a very good job of documenting that process. And I think documenting that process is essential to legitimating that process, right? Because it gets around the argument that there isn't a process, and it also shows the merits and the value of that process in a different way. The process doesn't necessarily have to be serving the same functions. At the end of the day, right, what you're evaluating might change based on its intended audience, based on its intended goal, but we need to have a very clear sense up front of what the intention of the work is and how we then go about evaluating. I think being much more clear and open about evaluative processes is essential. To that end, myself and Kathleen, Media Commons, received a grant from the Arthur Mellon Foundation to write a white paper on basically creating standardized protocols for open peer review. It's a very tough thing, right? Because you don't want to basically sort of limit what's done in that environment, but you also very much need that kind of clear sense of, you need for the rigor that does exist in those processes to come through in a way that maybe doesn't at the moment. And finally, I think we also need better ways to measure the value and impact of e-publications. And this is in some ways, again, back to thinking about how you get this type of work to be legitimated and valued within the academic institution. Numbers are, in some ways, both shocking and counterproductive. Right? I started off the presentation by saying that we had, that in December alone we had, 392,000 unique visitors, and to me that's an amazing thing. It's a huge number of people, but it tells us very little. Right? We don't know what people do with the works. We don't know why they come to the site. We don't know what they do with with the materials they encounter once they get there. We need to develop more sophisticated measurement tools that can actually basically try to qualitatively and quantitatively assess how online publications are used, whether in classroom settings, as sources for other published work, as intellectual fodder for stimulating conversations within our field. A better sense of how these works travel beyond their space. This may or may not ever sort of grant this type of e-publishing the sort of status of a traditional print publication, but it absolutely will sort of help recognize its value to the institution in a meaningful way, right? When you can basically, one of the things we've done in Media Res, for instance, is set up a mechanism through which people who come to the site can identify whether they use particular posts in their classroom settings, and some posts have hundreds and hundreds of people who say, yes, I've used this to teach it, as a teaching tool in the classroom, right? Suggesting at the very least it has an impact in terms of how we go about our daily jobs. One last point, then I'll let this go. I think at the end of the day, valuing e-publishing within academic institutions requires changing institutional perspectives, not changing e-publishing. Right? I think that this is often the sort of thing that we misunderstand. Right? We think that we need to make e-publishing more palatable or recognizable to the academy. I think it's the opposite. I think we need to basically push harder to have the academy reevaluate the kind of criteria through which they sort of judge value within institutionally. And that, in that sense, if for those of you who are interested in this, the responsibility in part falls to you, right? To basically be an advocate at all levels, not just to create this type of work, but to be an advocate institutionally for what its value is. I think basically getting into debates over whether e-publishing is just as good as print publishing is futile, right? Instead, we have to embrace its differences. We have to codify its functions and ways to evaluate them, and we need to demonstrate its actual value rather than merely its potential to these institutions. And I think if we do a better job of that, then this work will, in some way, will continue to flourish. Thank you very, very much.
Well, Abby has certainly raised a lot of important and intriguing questions, and what I've tried to do is to pull in not just someone from humanities, but from the sciences and from education from across the campus, and also at various points in their careers, so that we can try to kind of say, what's the cutting edge that people starting in the career, but also how does it affect people who are more senior. What I'd like to do first is just let each of our other three panelists kind of introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their experience in this realm of e-publishing and how it's fit into their career so far. So, Michelle, would you like to start?
Yeah, that works. Okay. Well, I am, have been here at OU for 25 years. So obviously, I've seen a lot of changes in terms of publishing, and e-publishing obviously wasn't around when I started my career many years ago. How I have been involved, I guess, is I'm sort of a traditional academic kind of person, with the vast majority of my publications being, hard print kinds of things. But I'm noticing an increasing number of online journals in psychology and sort of related fields. I have reviewed for online journals, and in one or two cases published in online journals. And I have to say that, I was the biggest skeptic, and to some degree I still am. But one of the things I've noticed is just a lot of variability in the e-journals that are out there. The first thing I do is I probably get about one offer a week to publish in my e-journal. The first thing I do is take a look at that online journal, and really I have been surprised. In one case in particular, there's a fairly well-known journal in my field that is an online journal, and I look up the editorial board. That's the first thing I do, and I was incredibly impressed. I've also seen a lot of e-journals that appear to be a little bit more international. So that's a nice thing that I certainly run across a lot of people that just can't get sometimes to these hard print journals as easily as many of us. So I look to the editorial boards. That's one thing I do. The second thing that I I'm a little nervous or worried about is I've passed on some of these calls for calls for specific kinds of aims and things to a lot of my grad students, and they've emailed back and they've said, did you notice in the fine print that they want $1,500 or $1,800 or $2,000, and automatically that's a red flag to me. And I do understand that they have programmers, they have editors, and etc. But that's kind of in my field, that's kind of taboo. Okay, you shouldn't be paying more than a nominal kind of fee for publishing your work. So I don't know about other disciplines, but that's kind of something that in my field anyway, I look, it's frowned upon. Another kind of piece of the puzzle for me is I've done some reviewing for online journals. And one of the things that I do, and I review a lot, and I'm on the editorial board of I think 4 journals maybe. And one of the things I do is when I'm asked to review articles, a lot of times I'll go to my students and say, would you like to also review this paper? Many of the better journals, the American psychological journals in my field, they want advanced graduate students to review those papers. Well, obviously their time is very limited and so forth. However, e-journals have been a little bit more open to the idea of having more junior graduate students review, and I think that's a good opportunity. In my case, I always do kind of my own independent second review, and then the student and I kind of talk over the paper and come to kind of a meeting of the minds usually before I submit a review. And I certainly always tell the journal that I've asked another graduate student to help with that and make sure that that's fine, because I want everything to be up front, and I want my student to get credit for that. And that's an opportunity. For some of you that maybe you aren't quite advanced enough to be a reviewer, maybe you are, but maybe you're not, this is a good place to start. As was mentioned earlier, typically at the very end of the year, if it is a blind process, your name should be listed on somewhere, either the beginning of the year, usually the end of the year, they list all the reviewers for that journal. So you want to make sure that that happens, or at least in your own CV, you very clearly document any reviewing that you have done. I guess another point, so many interesting points were mentioned, but one of the things I would think about as you're moving into academic positions, or even now, is to kind of talk over with your advisor or advisors sort of how e-journals are perceived in your field. Is this an option right now? I love the idea of getting involved. I love the idea of having communication with other scholars now. This is the time. These are going to be your peers. This is an easy way to get feedback, develop collaborations, etc. I think the cost of going to conferences is just becoming so cost prohibitive for many of us that I think that's an excellent way to really reach out and find these people. But again, I still, with respect to publishing at this point, with tenure obviously the way that things are, I want you to be careful in terms of, is this viewed the same, so to speak? And my last point, and then I'll turn it over, and that is, all of the journals that I've reviewed for that have been online have taken that traditional mode. I have never reviewed for a journal where it was not a double-blind procedure, so absolutely. I also kind of questioned a little bit, like, well, should I be as tough on this online journal? I'm less familiar maybe with some of them. Bottom line is, to a reviewer, I'm not changing my standards. I mean, it's kind of like, you know how sometimes you teach that class and you go, God, they're just, I feel like it's the bottom of the bell curve. What is going on this semester, and it's like, I'm not changing my standards. Same thing with the, reviewing. Don't expect to get, a free coast. It's going to be the same. Your standards are going to be the same, so don't expect that to happen. But in my case, again, it's always been sort of the traditional double-blind procedure. So at this point, at least in my field, it's more that we've sort of adopted, that standard quote procedure and kind of utilized it in an e-format. But again, I love the idea of a little bit more of an open, kind of an emerging kind of discussion and ability to really incorporate, that feedback and not just a yes/no kind of thing. And the very last point is also, I was a little nervous with a couple of times I reviewed just to kind of say, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm recommending, rejection of this paper, and I don't know if this journal maybe is a little bit more lenient, maybe they're a little bit, no. When I said no, they said no. I mean, they, editor followed right back up with, no. If you don't think, I even received a R&R, and I thought, no, I don't really feel that they have followed through and made these suggestions, and it was just a rejection either time. So, but I've certainly, accepted a number of papers. So, again, from sort of the other hat, if you will, I don't see a lot of difference. But again, in your CV, if you choose to do that, the onus is back on you to document that the journal is in fact a double-blind, procedure with respect to reviewing. Make sure you can, track those citations of that work, all of those kinds of things. They don't maybe seem to be the most important thing right now, but they will be important when it comes time for, getting that job or going up for tenure. So I'll stop there.
I'm Lucas Flood, and I am a third-year MFA student in the Creative Writing program, and I am managing editor, as was mentioned, for Fairly South Review. It is a literary magazine that is housed in our MFA department. It is staffed entirely by our students, and we are an online publication. And as was mentioned, you can find us at fairlysouth.com. In terms of, I guess it's a little bit out of the purview of the other conversations we've been having, because, obviously a literary review is a slightly different thing than an academic publication, but the same debate is going on within the literary community, as with the academic community, as to the legitimacy of online publications versus the standard print publications. And I think that the online publications are year by year gaining ground. They're in, for example, the Best American Short Story anthology that comes out every year features, this last year had 2 selections from an online only journal, both from Hobart Journal. So as to the benefits of, or as to why we are online here at Fairly South, it's primarily a cost issue, as the presenter brought up. We don't have a large budget for the journal, and then we can do a lot more with the online journal. We can reach a lot more people. We can link our journal to various social networking and pull a lot of people in. But we maintain the same process and standards as a print journal. I worked on a print journal before when I was earning my master's degree in literature at another school. I was an assistant editor for a print-only journal, and we follow the exact same processes. We take submissions and have editorial teams and try to be selective. So I guess I'll wait to see if there are more questions.
Bob, if you want to introduce yourself, and then maybe we will ask for questions. So,
Hi, I'm Bob Lucky. Excuse me. I always say, I've been here at the university 118 years. And I say that for two reasons. One, to admit the truth perhaps, but also eventually to talk about the promotion and tenure process that I'm very much a part of. And that comes into a very serious part of your professional decisions as you move forward. I think we are in a period of transition. It's a fairly new phenomenon, driven, and I believe in part, by economics. Right now, we researchers are being paid to produce knowledge, and yet at the same time we're charging under the traditional model of being charged for that same knowledge, the very stuff that we wrote, by the publishing companies. And there's some publications out there that talk about the enormous profit margins that these companies, these enterprises, in fact, three enterprises, three publishers, are making off of our work, which seems to be an absurd paradigm, a way of looking at how we handle the generation of knowledge. So we look for better options, and they're very exciting. I'm very much a part of it, in spite of my gray hair, and I look forward to these. But on the other hand, as our deliberations continue, I'll talk about how sometimes in these promotion and tenure deliberations, the issue of quality always comes to the surface. Quality of the work, quality of the publication subsequently, and therefore the notion of peer-reviewed, of citation indexes, or other measures, metrics that are involved in the assessment of the publication itself. So those are very real considerations. I've also mentioned another graduate student and I have worked together with an Apple product, writing a book for an online book project for sale, and I'll make some comments about that as we move forward.
Are there any things that have arisen in your mind? Yes?
Hi, my name is Del Martin. I'm a PhD candidate in public policy. And my question is about the online, the Media Commons site. Have you considered inviting top scholars as reviewers, or coming up with a type of reviewers board that that you invite them in? And then where I'm getting this idea is from the TED website, which has gained a lot of credibility. They bring in the people who are experts on these areas and share that information. And so I was wondering if you consider that too. Let me try to repeat the question a little bit. The question has to do with considering at Media Commons putting together an editorial board of experts, and I will address that.
Sure. That's a great question, and actually a really good idea in a lot of ways. I'll tell you what we have done, and I'll tell you sort of the direction we're moving in. So we do have an editorial board or an advisory board that basically consists of top named scholars in the field. They are essentially tasked with evaluating projects that are submitted at a much larger scale. Each one of those advisory board members is also then the editor of a particular project, right? So in other words, if someone comes and they say, I want to create a new project for Media Commons, it's vetted within our editorial board and then within our advisory board. And then if it's accepted, then that person who proposes it becomes a member of the advisory board and is also responsible for sort of figuring out a vetting process for content for their particular project. Right now, I think that there's a lot to be said about basically inviting experts to sort of evaluate work in a sort of post-publication model, right? The idea is it's already published, but now you're going to invite an expert in to basically, or several experts in to sort of assess its merit. I think that before that can really happen properly, like I said, I believe that we need to have a much clearer sense of what we're evaluating. And this is really the issue for, and I say this may be something that's very idiosyncratic and specific to the field of media studies, right, which is studying essentially sort of media institutions, media texts, media audiences, right, but that there's a lot of multimodal and multi-mediated work happening in this environment. As I said, people trying to basically write visual essays and, essentially compose, create what we think was hybrid creative and scholarly works, and there simply isn't at this point in time a very clear sense of what to evaluate. And I think sort of, and I do think that certainly bringing top experts, it gives it a kind of legitimacy, but I don't know necessarily that it does the kind of the trick. What we've move towards, or I should say what we're moving towards, is a couple of different things. One, we're moving towards an open model where the person who submits a work basically makes a request for the types of reviews that they want. So we're interested in this process by which when you submit a work, you might have a very clear audience in mind for this work, right? Maybe you're creating something that is prescriptive, or you want, you think of this thing as art, and you want basically someone who has expertise in that area to evaluate. So you have the ability to make suggestions about the types of people you would like to bring into the review process. And then we also rely upon a real name sort of requirement in Media Commons, meaning that anybody who basically participates in Media Commons, either by submitting materials or by posting any sort of review of those materials, whether in the comment field or something more authoritative, has to basically use their real name so that their credentials are always attached to what they're doing. This has led to situations where we do have a lot of top name scholars who do respond to this work, but it's also led to situations where younger and junior scholars who have often some of the most interesting and insightful things to say. It's a truism, right, that the longer you do this, the more you rely upon your graduate students to introduce you to new work, right, because they're the ones out there who are basically sort of reading all things that are, at the cutting edge. It also gives opportunities, I think, to younger and emerging scholars to basically demonstrate that they have, ideas that are worth considering. I think we sometimes overly fetishize the senior level at the sort of risk of sort of not honoring the kind of work that younger people are doing in that regard. I hope that answers your question. You're kind of hidden from me, so I can't really say.
Other questions? Yes.
So I'm in human factors. So we do actually have a lot of academic bloggers, and a lot of their work is actually shared through research blogging networks, which are kind of peer-reviewed before they're published. So what are your takes on blogging, maybe as grad students or as faculty?
All right. The question has to do with how does blogging perhaps fit in? And we do have people who are needing to leave. Ben, have we distributed the
it's up still in the back though, in case anyone hasn't.
The evaluations.
Evaluation.
Okay, so please fill those out for us, if you will. Would anyone like to begin the discussion? Bob?
I don't have a single horse here to ride, but that's really never taken into account in serious tenure and promotion deliberations. So it's more how it broadened your career.
More formative.
Exactly.
Anyone else have a comment?
I think that basically it depends on the discipline, but I think for the most part there are probably very few disciplines at the moment that recognize the blog alone as a as a sort of as a publication per se. Although I'd be interested in knowing the kind of ways in which review happens pre-publication of the blog. I think that for especially young scholars, as a reputation building mechanism, it's really valuable, right? I think. And I will say, in my own career, and as someone who just received tenure, here, I've operated as a, in two spheres, and I think those of you I think we're still at a stage because we are transitioning where I think most of you are probably going to have to still consider traditional print publishing alongside more online sources, and I think you cannot basically sort of rely entirely on a blog, but I would say that if you are basically, if you have a blog that has a not only well-trafficked, but basically repeatedly is sort of recognized in the field in various ways, that will certainly enhance your reputation. It won't probably be enough, but it'll contribute in some ways to the way in which you are appreciated, as long as you have other things to show alongside it.
It almost seems to me like, as Michelle, was talking about the difficulty of going to conferences sometimes. That kind of forum almost would replace meeting graduate students of other faculty at conferences and get your name out there. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think at one point each of you mentioned cost, and I tend to strongly agree with Dr. Santo's idea that access should be expanded more to the public, and then in terms of publishing and also like purveying information. And I'm wondering, I'm in industrial organizational psychology, and a lot of us we do earn the doctoral degree, but we go into applied. And I'm wondering, how can, these journal subscriptions and journal articles are pretty exorbitant, 18 to 30 bucks for one article. I don't know how much a subscription would be. So I'm wondering, what other ways are there to fund the journal? Do you open up ad space? How else? How do you keep it so, the general public, if they want it, can publish and keep up with the work?
Right, so if I understand the question correctly, it's how do we get our research out to the general public better and not have them face the costs of it, and also be able to publish with those costs?
There are several models that are out there. University presses are moving more to some of this work, providing the work of their scholars in the larger communities, and so to a certain degree some of the costs are absorbed there. But in many cases there's a fee attached, and one of the terms, and I don't know that it exists in all different disciplines, is a notion of vanity press, that you can pay to have a book published or work out there, and there's a very negative aura over that whole notion, so it's very distasteful to have author pay. But any number of these online publications, the open access journals, have author fees. Now, it isn't always paid by the author. In many cases it will either be waived if there's not a funding agency, or if the institution doesn't have certain funds. But as I say, this is a moving target. This is something that's developing right now. It's not always clear, and once in a while that fee comes to the author, and as was suggested here, sometimes that fee is shocking, $1,500. And I was a co-author on a piece that cost us $300 each. That's a very nasty taste in one's mouth, but right now that's part of what one experiences.
I think that it raises, of course, a broader concern that I think several of the panelists have also addressed, which is, that our careers to some extent are staked upon our ability to basically get our sort of knowledge or our scholarship out there. But increasingly, the publishers that we work with at academic or quasi-academic presses are subjected to market forces that don't concern us, right? That increasingly university presses are making decisions about what books to publish, not based on the quality of the scholarship, but based on how many copies of the book they think they can sell to classrooms, right? And that has a tremendously detrimental effect on knowledge creation, because it basically forces us to sort of pick hot button topics that are sexy, that are going to sell, rather than basically really develop work that we are deeply, invested in. So I think on one hand, the value of open online publishing is it can get around some of those concerns, even as it also can be privy to many of the same ones. I think that what we're seeing is an alternate model is a kind of rethinking on the parts of some publishers of making the content free but charging for the delivery modes. So in other words, you can read the article for free online, but if you want to create a course packet for your class, then there's a charge attached to basically compiling these pieces into an anthology. So you're paying for the different delivery methods, right? But you can also read it for free online. Versionings, right? So in other words, in the case of complex TV, which I showed you a bit of on Media Commons, NYU Press is going to print a regular book, and they're going to charge, $29.99 for it, and that's what there is. You can read the version of it for free online that we have on Media Commons. That's not going to go down, but that is considered, version 1. Version 2 is the one that has incorporated the feedback. So there's different kind of, depending on how much of a final product you want, that can sometimes be the way to sort of think about it.
Within my field, actually the idea of a profit is something that only entertained by the very highest levels, and so most of the material is available free. All of our material is free. We don't charge for submissions, although a lot of journals do make some revenue. Literary journals make revenue through contests, but then there'll be a payout, and a lot of times that payout will, we had one this semester where we we're paying it all back out to the winner. So it's kind of more of a labor of love, the idea of being those who are interested in staying in academia within creative writing will get enough publications to get a job teaching creative writing, and then get paid that way. That's pretty much the goal, I hope.
Yes, another question.
Would you talk a little bit about any web analytics that you use for Beverly South or Media Commons, and do you do any marketing to drive traffic to your sites?
The question has to do with web analytics, which I'm not even familiar with, and marketing that may be done.
I can actually address that. We just started using the technical editor. So we just started.
If you'd like to come up here so the lights can hear you.
My name's Eric. I'm the technical editor at Beverly South. I help with the website and the blog and everything like that. We just started using Google Analytics within the last 60 days. So our results on that are still coming back. Mostly as far as driving traffic, we use social media and getting our word out there that way.
We have advertisements in some websites like New Pages and in Poets and Writers,
Deotra.
Sources.
It can be really useful in terms of just providing raw, accurate numbers. So for instance, the number, the 392,000 page views we had in December, that's Google Analytics, telling us that. What that necessarily means, is open to interpretation. So one of the things we're actually doing is we're working currently with NYU, New York University's digital library services to try and develop a more sophisticated measurement tool, one that basically not only counts page hits, but tries to get a much more, a better sense of how materials are being utilized. Because I think at the end of the day, for scholars, simply being able to say that more people see your work, it will only get you that far, right? I mean, yes, that's, it's a valuable argument when you consider the average academic article, at least in my field, is read by maybe, 300 or 400 people. That to say that you're getting hundreds of thousands of people coming to your site is impressive, but I think we have to have a much more nuanced understanding of what's going on that we're not quite getting yet with the current analytical tools. We also use social media, Twitter, Facebook in particular. What we're trying to do with those is not just promote content on the site, but also use those as ways to extend the site's presence in other places. So for instance, for the survey question that we do on the Media Commons front page, we also retweet the question every day to try and get people to sort of, give us, their 142 character responses to it, which are, if you think that 400 words is difficult, you should see academics trying to respond 142 characters. But we're trying to basically utilize those to not just promote the site, but also basically promote this kind of experience that's happening sort of around scholars.
Well, do people subscribe? Do they have like double opt-in email addresses so that you have a list of subscribers that you can reach out and touch?
With our format, we don't have subscriptions. You just go to the website and you can enter in there.
For us, you create a user account. It's free. You don't pay anything, but you do provide. But to create a user account, you have to provide an email address. And once you create your user account, you have several functions that you can select. So you can select if you can opt out or into emails for particular projects or emails for the site itself, either on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. Right? So you can choose to say, I want to get the daily update of what's new on the site, or I can choose to get nothing, and I'll, when I log into Facebook and I see this announcement there, I'll go. But you do have to basically provide us with email address.
Just to kind of comment on that, I will say this much, and I'm sure you all have the same experience, which is, I guess you created an account for print journals, and I'm shocked at how many emails I get, monthly from different journals saying, okay, here's what's, in press now. And to be perfectly honest with you, that is an excellent idea. I mean, I rarely delete. I actually kind of go, let's see what's out there. And so I find myself kind of gravitating to journals that I am getting, the emails from. So for those of you who are thinking about doing this, that's an excellent idea.
Yeah, and kind of to elaborate on something that Lucas made me think of, there's really kind of a continuum. You have your hard copy, but then you have the hard copy journals that are now online. And then Lucas said, e-only, and those are the ones that I think are kind of that we're struggling with, that there have to be the evaluation kind of things in place. And when we get to promotion and tenure kinds of decisions, those are the ones that you as young academics are going to have to decide, can I publish in this e-only journal and document it enough that it's going to count as a publication when I get to promotion or tenure. I know you've probably been involved in more of those decisions than any of us.
Well, once again, it comes down to looking at what's been out there and the prestige, if you will, of the publication, and in this case, measured by some pretty traditional metrics. And even though we may resist that, that's right now the way the game is played.
I'll add that there are some journals like Shenandoah who was they were traditionally a rather prestigious print journal, and they've moved recently to online only. Because and just the kind of the proliferation of online journals has shaken things up a lot in the field. And as far as prestige goes in the online realm, it's just selectivity is something to look at. How many pieces are being ran, say, per issue in a piece. We have actually been experimenting at Beverly South with just accepting less work and thus better work, and we've seen increase in positive responses both online and on our social network. Social networking comments, we just got back from the AWP conference in Boston where we had a lot of traffic at our booth. So yeah, it's just kind of selectivity is important, and you'll see bigger names in the field perhaps even solicited in some of the online journals.
I think one of the things that's really interesting. We did a survey about 3 years ago of our contributors to Media Commons, and we asked them to sort of tell us how they list their what they publish with us on their CVs. And what we found was, one, a tremendously diverse and eclectic listing. Right, some people list them as publications, some people list them as service. It tended to range. Some people would be under publication. Some people would list them as an invited publication because sometimes we have invited people to participate, which perhaps gives it a sort of allure of prestige. Other people would sort of list it as a sort of non-peer-reviewed publication, and so you have the same type of content identified very differently on CVs. But where we saw patterns emerge really have to do with rank and position, right? That graduate students and senior faculty, so the very low end and the very high end, were the ones who would tend to list them as publications, although they varied in terms of their prestige. Senior faculty, of course, were in a position once they'd been tenured to basically argue for the validity of certain forms as publications. And I think graduate students are often eager to sort of suggest that they're participating in that conversation. Junior faculty, people, assistant professors, especially early on in their career, were much more hesitant to sort of identify these things as publications, and that and it was an interesting sort of thing where I think it spoke to the kind of uncertainties, especially in relation to the tenure and promotion practice and what this serves. By and large, most people who participate tell us that it's valuable to them, in terms of being able to get their work out there, being able to participate in conversation. They're appreciative of it, but nonetheless, when it comes to sort of then retrofitting that into the kind of tenure and promotion process at their institutions, an uncertainty about where to sort of place it, and perhaps almost a fear that if they identified it as a publication, they would be hit harder than if they simply listed it as service, right? Which sort of counts for less, but at the very least, we're probably not get caught. We're not coming to fire by tenure and promotion by many tenure and promotion committees.
Other questions? Other comments anyone on the panel would like to make?
Just a real brief one. The Apple product that one of my doctoral students and I worked with is iBooks Author. Anytime you are interested in getting a book online from Apple, you go through iTunes and you have a book and you're reading it through iBooks. And there's this piece of software that is really very slick that converts text into a book, and you can get it approved and sold through Apple. What was interesting about it is that instead of a royalty rate of 6%, 7%, it's 66%, but you have to be the promoter of that. And it just so happens that I worked with a fellow who was in a place in his life where he could spend a lot of time doing that, and he wrote his own book. It can be done. It opens the world to a new range of options.
What you're going to need to do is keep your eye on this, and certainly whenever you wind up at an institution, find out what their policies are, what their perspectives are on this as you go forward. Because you don't want to do a lot of work that's not going to count at that point. And, it's likely to change. I suspect that it's going to move as we develop those criteria, as we come to it's 100 years, we may not have any print journals. It may all be online. So, eventually it'll work its way through, but for your generation, it may be a bit of a moving target. Any other questions, or I'm not going to keep you here on a Friday afternoon. We feel like we have exhausted our topic. Again, let me urge you to sign the attendance sheet if you haven't, and to leave us your evaluation of the event, and help yourself with cookies and other refreshments as you leave. Thank you very much for attending.